Hello and welcome back. I'm Dr. Feist here at St. Paul University, and I'm still talking in this video in my little series on H.A. Prichard, his work, the 1912 paper, Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? So I'm at video number 6 in this series, and this is just a little short one, kind of, shall we say, a summing up, the upshot of what's been happening, and a couple of reflections before we move on in later videos to dig into exactly what Prichard thought morality and ethics was really about. So we're just taking an upshot here, looking at the upshot of what he thinks it's not about. So let's recap. So why should I be moral? That's his central question in his paper. Does moral philosophy rest on a mistake? And of course, he's answering yes. Why should I be moral? The upshot of all the discussions, go back and have a look at those, of his criticisms, that is, of the tradition, namely the consequentialist and deontological ways of answering this, he thinks are problematic. And he says, if you want to sum it up, you can think of it this way. Both of them think that the answer to this kind of a question is some kind of argument, right? Philosophers like arguments. Not surprising that they answer this question with an argument. In other words, that the argument is a kind of process of non-moral thinking that leads to the obligation. So the process of non-moral thinking really is connected to looking at the premises. So Prichard is saying something like this. He's going, look, we do not, emphasis, we do not appreciate, we do not learn about or come to, or whatever term you really want to use here, we do not appreciate obligation via an argument. You don't, if someone wants an argument for an obligation, they're asking or they're desiring the wrong thing. And even then, keep in mind, desires are not supposed to be part of the moral story. We don't appreciate obligation via an argument. There's no inference, again, this kind of process from non-moral premises down to a moral conclusion. So you don't go from the is to the ought. There's none of that, right? So don't think that you can go like that. No, that's the wrong way to think about it. So that's his general thing. You can't go from an is to an ought. We've seen that. Go back a couple videos and check that out if you're not sure about the is-ought issue. Hume's problem, as I called it. So we're not also going to appreciate an act's intrinsic goodness or the act's intrinsic goodness of the act's consequences. So neither the act's goodness in and of itself or the act's consequences, their intrinsic goodness, and then infer an obligation, as in, well, that's good, so you should, right? So good then should, or good makes right. No, our sense of an act's rightness is not derived from any goodness, whether it's the act's goodness or the consequences' intrinsic goodness. There's no right from good. So you don't, so think about Prichard trying to block certain inferences that people have made, that you get the ought from an is. Nope. That you get the right from good. You infer a right from good. Nope. He also wants to block the other way. The relationship that it's not right from good. Well, maybe it's, you move that the good from right. Right? So the good and the right, depends. Maybe you infer one, you take one as a base and then infer the other. I'll take the good and then I'll infer the right, or I'll take the right and infer the good. No, Prichard wants to block both of those. An act, he says, is good because it is right and done from a sense of obligation. So we're going to look more at this here, this sense of obligation as well. And an act is right. It lies in its origination. Now, go back and look at a couple previous videos where I discussed origination. But this is separate from motivation. So the rightness of an act is not something that's connected to the good of the act, and it's not something that arises from motivation. So you want to keep all these concepts separate and not move around like traditional philosophy has done from like an is to an ought, or saying the good or the right is primary and then deriving the other. So what Prichard is trying to do, you can think of it, is block a number of pretty standard inferences that we make. Now, so there's your upshot. There's a couple of things that Prichard dwells upon here before he gets into the positive side of his thinking, like we'll do more on origination. We talked a little bit about that. You can have a look at it. And we'll look a little bit more about motivation and what right really is. So those concepts we'll return to. But he's very clear that when you're acting morally out of this sense of obligation, that's it. So obligation is this sense of obligation, that's your motivation, right? So you do have a motivation. However, it's not a motivation in the sense of desire. So what he wants to split is this notion of motivation into a couple of different species. So motivation then, if we think about it more like a genus concept, and that is like morality deals with obligation. Virtue, he's going to talk about as being a bit different. But with motivation, he's got a couple of different species of it. So in this sense, think of more motivation as being split as it's a genus, like animal, and it would have different species like, dog, elephant. In this case, motivation as a genus would be split into things like motivation by desires. Right? That's one thing that gets that motivates us, desires. No denying that. But that's not really what's going on in morality. So keep in mind that there is motivation, but not desires. So in that sense, remember, desires are concerned with purposes and ends. So when I act on a purpose, I want to bring something about, and it could be a very lofty thing. I want to bring about world peace. World peace is something I desire. So I'm acting on my desire for world peace. So desires don't have to be interpreted as like bad or negative, right? It's not like desire is just simply like I desire something for myself. I may desire something very lofty and very noble, something that we would agree is good. But that's not really what motivation is in the ethical sense. So desires, these are going to be linked up with purposes, ends, like goals, however you can phrase it. But these are, in other words, kinds of states that you're trying to bring about. That's not really the ground of, that's not the kind of motivation. Remember, the species of motivation. Rather, it's the sense of obligation. That's what's important for Prichard. In truly acting morally, it's going to be a sense of obligation. Now, think about this, though. This has consequences because it splits morality and virtue, says Prichard. If you look at motivation again, desires, having purposes, ends, and goals, these can also include, of course, as desires do, like our passions, right? So emotions, passions. And that, of course, links up with virtue, because remember, the whole idea of virtue, in a nutshell, is really putting your passions and your desires, your passions, in with reason. Reason has to run the show, but passions are part of the story. So when you're acting virtuously, there's a passion involved. Usually it's pleasure. So you do something good or whatever. When you do it virtuously, you're doing it with a pleasure involved. You may not even have a sense of obligation. And as a matter of fact, if you dig into Aristotle, he doesn't talk about obligations. He talks about, maybe something that's right to do, and you recognize that it's something right, but you won't really approach it as an obligation. You'll approach it from the virtue perspective of it's a pleasurable thing to do. So becoming virtuous means aligning my pleasures with the sense of things that you should do. You're not acting out of the sense of obligation. It's the pleasure to do things. So virtue is over here in the motivation with desires. And for Prichard, no, he's going to move it over. For him, morality is over here. That's a sense of obligation. So what we've got now is a split between morality and virtue. So in this sense now, The emotions are involved in virtue, and when you're acting morally, you're really acting only from a sense of obligation. So what we want to look at now in future videos is to get clear on what's the positive side. In other words, what does he think is actually going on in the sense of obligation? Where does that come from? Or more precisely, like, what exactly is it? Well, we'll have a look at that in a future video. Stay tuned.